Nature. It can be a delight. Walking in the park, hearing the trees sway in the wind, and seeing the occasional puppy are all great ways to get a boost of serotonin, a chemical messenger we can thank for being related to feelings of happiness. We even bring nature inside like houseplants. If your houseplant situation has gotten out of control during the lockdown, well, I've got great news for you. That little jungle can probably make you a little happier. Let's talk a bit more about how that works.
Instagram is full of seemingly happy plant owners cultivating succulents and philodendrons. You might have even seen local plant stores advertise their wares as stress-reducing roommates. And the truth is, there is some evidence that houseplants are good for your mental health. It's just not really clear why. We've been studying how houseplants make us feel for decades in a range of different indoor situations, but some of the most robust evidence that houseplants can improve mental health comes from hospitals. For example, a study from 2009 looked at how the presence of plants and flowers affected the recovery of 90 patients in the hospital for hemorrhoidectomies. And that is what it sounds like. It's a time in your life when it's probably not bad to have a plant friend around. They found that patients in rooms with plants did fare better. Their blood pressure was lower, and they reported less pain, anxiety, and fatigue. The patients also said that the plants helped them to relax and feel less anxious and made them feel more positively about the hospital staff caring for them. And the researchers who led this study have found similar results with plants in the rooms of appendectomy and thyroidectomy patients as well. The thing is, these hospital studies don't tell us a whole lot about why this effect occurs, just that it seems to. Researchers have tried to drill deeper into mechanisms by looking at plants in other indoor environments like offices. And these studies seem to back up the idea that plants can positively affect our moods, but the data start to get a little murkier. One of the big questions is whether plants affect specific cognitive processes, and therefore make us feel better by lifting our mental load, or are just generally de-stressing. Some psychologists think that indoor plants and other living things have a restorative effect based on the idea of attention restoration theory. According to this theory, voluntary attention, the attention needed for things that aren't inherently fascinating but must be focused on nonetheless, is finite. But if you can just stop focusing so hard on things, you can give your mind time to replenish its attention reserves. And plants may help you do that because they are inherently interesting, so you don't have to force yourself to pay attention to them. One research team found that having plants in a room did help the 34 student participants to increase their attention capacity after a proofreading task. But they felt that that might have been because the plants made the room feel more pleasant and reduced the participants' stress levels in general rather than having a real restorative effect. And there are good reasons to suspect that the presence of plants is just kind of relaxing. Like in a 2013 study, 18 tested participants reported being more comfortable in an office environment with plants than a space without them. Even if a relaxing effect is real and directly induced by the plants themselves, it still doesn't tell us what about plants makes us feel less stressed. Researchers in that 2013 study asked the participants to say what they preferred in terms of color, odor, and plant size, and found that the group favored small, green, lightly scented plants. So it may be that those sensory experiences, seeing small bits of green or smelling living things, somehow triggers relaxation. But unfortunately, studies that have tried to tease out whether it's the color, three-dimensional shape, scent, or some other aspect of a plant that really matters haven't shed a ton of light on things. In part, that's because many of the studies use surveys to ask the participants about their emotional and psychological responses to the plants. While these results are relatively consistent across studies, they're subjective measures prone to all kinds of biases. And linking mental states to more objective measures like physiological changes is tricky at best. Many studies look at changes to blood oxygenation in parts of the brain, for example. Participants in these studies wear a special sensor that uses spectroscopy to measure near-infrared light absorption. You see, red blood cells absorb light differently when they're carrying a lot of oxygen. And since oxygenation and blood flow in the brain have been linked to neural activity, this measure might give the researchers a peek at how the brain is responding to different conditions. But studies often get confusing results. Like in a 2016 study, researchers had 24 men in their 20s look at either live plants or an empty flower box for 3 minutes. After that, the scientists detected a decrease in blood oxygenation in the right prefrontal cortex in the plant viewing group. That went hand in hand with reports of feeling more comfortable and relaxed by viewing the plants. So you might think less prefrontal cortex oxygenation equals a more relaxed state of mind. But another study from 2015 found significant increases in blood oxygenation in both the left and the right prefrontal cortex when 18 participants viewed a real plant as opposed to a projected image of it. This lack of consistency shows just how difficult it can be to untangle the correlations between physiological and psychological responses. And some researchers have been critical of the methodology of studies looking at indoor plant effects on mood in general. A 2009 review of 21 studies took issue with a number of methods in the field, including the fact that studies often used small sample sizes. You wouldn't expect the effects of indoor plants to be huge, and if they have small effects from a statistical perspective, you'd need a large number of participants to pick them up. Similarly, they criticized the variation in how the plants were presented in different studies. The type, size, and placement of plants, as well as the duration of exposure, all differ greatly, and that makes results difficult to compare. But the reviewers did feel that the question of whether or not indoor plants can affect our mental health is worth studying, so they made some recommendations for future experiments. These included implementing more systematic approaches to plant exposure and making sure that studies looking at restorative effects of plants actually had the participants do something taxing enough to require restoration. So even though we've been studying this for decades, we still don't seem to understand why we see positive effects from plants in places like hospitals, or if the results mean houseplants boost your brain power or improve your mental health in general. But look, here's the situation. Those plants on your desk and by your couch are almost definitely not harmful to you, as long as you're not allergic to them or something. So if you feel like your world is better when your desk or living room looks a little bit more like a jungle, you do you.
So there you have it. It doesn't matter what your friends say. Having all of those houseplants can brighten your mood. But I mean, if you'd rather scale things up a little and take advantage of the free serotonin, what impact would the whole forest have on you? If one plant might do us good, then the more, the merrier, right? Here's more on why nature makes us feel better.
It's probably no surprise that nature is beneficial to our mental health. From hitting the beach to taking a long stroll through the park, multiple studies have shown that there's something about nature that helps us feel happier, more focused, or just generally better. But why that happens is trickier to figure out. From what psychologists can tell, though, it's not just about getting in some sunshine and vitamin D. Instead, it might have to do with our sense of belonging. The idea that nature is healing is not a new one, and exposure to natural environments has been an important part of mental health treatments for a long time. As early as the Middle Ages, monasteries for those with mental illnesses created so-called restorative gardens. And in the 1800s, people designing mental hospitals would try and make sure their buildings were surrounded by acres of natural land. So far, modern research really supports this idea too. Studies have shown that being exposed to nature, whether it's a wilderness preserve or a tree-lined city street, can improve well-being in a bunch of ways, both in those with and without clinical conditions. For example, a 2011 meta-analysis looked at studies involving a total of almost 850 participants, mostly students, and found that exercising in a natural environment resulted in higher feelings of revitalization than doing the same exercise indoors. And a study from 2012 found that walking through nature for 50 minutes provided a mood boost and other cognitive benefits for 20 participants with depression. There's also evidence to suggest that those with schizophrenia, ADHD, and a whole host of other illnesses experience similar benefits just from taking in a little scenery. So far, there are several factors that have been floated around as possible explanations for this. One is that nature allows us to recover from stress and attention fatigue. This is the idea that urban environments have too many things competing for our attention. Other studies suggest that nature offers exercise opportunities, facilitation of social interaction and development, and opportunities for personal development in general. But a lot of these factors haven't been investigated in rigorous depth. They also don't really explain the mechanism of how we gain psychological benefits just from existing in nature rather than running around in nature or chilling with friends in nature. nature. In fact, most research on the subject seems to describe the mechanisms as elusive, which is psychologists speak for, we don't know, we're working on it. Still, that doesn't mean that we don't have a hypothesis or two. Some researchers argue that these positive effects, at least in part, come about because of an increased sense of connectedness to the natural world. One significant experiment about this was published in 2009 in Environment and Behavior, and it looked at the effect of exposure to nature on mood and problem solving. In this study, 76 students were asked to complete questionnaires on mood, along with the Connectedness with Nature Scale, or CNS, which measures pretty much what the name implies. It asks participants to rate how they feel about some vaguely hippie-ish stuff, like, right now, I'm feeling a sense of oneness with the natural world. Or, I'm feeling like the natural world is a community to which I belong. After rating 13 of those peace and love statements, the students were split into 2 groups and bundled onto buses for a field trip. They took a 20-minute drive to either a nature reserve or a downtown parking lot. Then they spent around 15 minutes silently walking, sitting, and taking in the scenery before filling out those questionnaires again. The results showed that the participants who went to the nature reserve reported significantly more of a mood boost from their trip. Their feelings of being connected with nature were also higher than those who took a stroll in a parking lot. Now, this in itself is not massively surprising. You could imagine it's probably hard to feel at one with the universe standing on a stretch of concrete. What was more interesting is that the CNS survey results seemed to mediate the effects of the environment. More specifically, when people reported that they felt like part of nature, their mood boost tended to be bigger, so it wasn't just about seeing nature, it was about feeling like they were part of it. The scientists behind this experiment argue that it's that sense of connectedness that causes all those positive benefits, and they cite something called the biophilia hypothesis as a possible mechanism for this. The hypothesis theorizes that since evolutionarily speaking, we're used to living in natural environments, we all have some innate urge to seek out nature. The researchers suggest that we need to see ourselves as part of it, belonging to the same group as the various plant and wildlife species we share our planet with. It can be hard to prove evolutionary hypotheses like this, especially when they're as abstract as this one, but the concept that we need to belong to groups to stay mentally healthy is one of the main principles of social psychology research. In fact, it's such an important concept that having a sense of belonging with other people is seen as a core human need in some models. Not having this sense of belonging can lead to things like lowered immune response and poorer sleep quality, and conveniently, those are exactly the kind of functions researchers have seen improve when we're exposed to natural environments. So it's not that huge of a stretch to think that maybe that need to feel like we belong extends beyond human interactions to seeing ourselves as part of the wider ecosystem of the planet. It's a plausible idea, and the results of this study certainly support it, but like with a lot of other big ideas, it would help to have more research to be sure. If nothing else though, studies do suggest that time in nature is really good for you. So even if you don't totally know why, it's probably worth visiting your local park sometime. Your brain and your mood will thank you.
So trees are pretty neat, and having more time around them might be pretty good for us. But something else I count on every time I go to the park are all the really cute doggies. I mean, who can resist those fluffy ears? But some dogs aren't just cute. They can be great at providing therapy too. So hang out with Britt next to see what these little fluffy dogs can do.
Maybe you've been here. It's final season and you're walking across campus when suddenly a big, beautiful sign catches your attention. Exam Week Therapy Dogs. And when you show up, it's a giant room full of well-trained, adorable puppers and college students leaving with looks of stress-free bliss. Pet therapy has been around in some form or another for over 100 years. And today, it's part of programs everywhere, from hospitals to college campuses. Many studies have shown that it works, too, and that pets can relieve anxiety, stress, and provide comfort. But these effects don't just happen because animals are cute. Instead, they actually say a lot more about what it means to be human. Although it likely existed in some form before then, pet therapy was first popularized around 1860 thanks to the famous nurse Florence Nightingale. She noticed that patients with chronic illness felt better when they had an animal partner by their side. Now, these programs can be found basically everywhere there are people. The technical term for this treatment is animal-assisted therapy, or AAT. There are all kinds of variations, but two are especially common. In one type of program, a handler will bring an animal to an outside location situation, like a college campus or nursing home, for people to interact with. The other kind is more structured and often involves a counselor or social worker. This type of therapy can include everything from playing with a dog to caring for a horse, and it's often combined with other forms of treatment depending on the patient. Regardless of the program, though, multiple studies have shown that AAT has a positive, measurable effect, both in those with and without clinical conditions. For example, several have shown that petting and playing with a dog can improve patients' moods by decreasing their distress and pain. Specifically, a visiting dog can boost your body's productions of endorphins, which ultimately trigger the release of chemicals that act like painkillers and produce euphoria. Dog visits have also been shown to decrease levels of cortisol, norepinephrine, and epinephrine in patients, which are all stress hormones. Like most things in science, there are some papers that haven't found such significant results. But for the most part, researchers are pretty confident that AAT works. It just might not be because of the reasons you'd think. For one, these effects don't just apply to animal lovers. They appear in people who feel neutral about animal companions too. And it's not just because the animals are super outgoing and always excited to see you either, like dogs typically are. Pretty much all animal companions do the trick for these kinds of therapies. Rabbits, horses, cats, you name it. Even animal farms full of goats and cows are helpful. The effects aren't even because these animals are soft or fluffy. Several studies have also shown that fish, bearded dragons, and crickets can help increase focus and positive emotions. Instead, the secret to AAT seems to be about the bond between humans and animals in general. After all, whether you're sick, stressed, or just trying to process life, animal companions won't judge you. But they will be there for you. Most studies have focused on AAT's effects and not the underlying mechanism, so it's hard to say for sure that this is the case. And it probably varies depending on the person and the animal too. But in general, an unconditional, non-judgmental relationship with animals could give patients a safe place to process emotions or try new tasks. One study also suggested they could be a helpful distraction from other problems or symptoms, or a place to practice social interactions. And there's some evidence for the importance of the human-animal relationship in studies that have been done so far. In a study published in the Journal of Anxiety, Stress, and Coping in 2003, 58 people without clinical diagnoses were presented with a stressful situation. They were told that they might be asked to hold a tarantula sitting elsewhere in the room. Those who considered this while petting an animal, whether it was a soft, fluffy rabbit or a hard-shelled turtle, experienced a reduction in stress and anxiety. But those who were petting a plush toy version of those animals didn't display the same effects. Which makes sense if the relationship and interactions with the animal are key. On the flip side, though, other studies with dementia patients have shown that robot dogs are effective at reducing stress and anxiety. These robots looked, sounded, and behaved a lot like the real thing, and the patients responded to them a lot like they did with real animals. So the benefits of the relationship were probably replicated, unlike with the plush toys in the other study. It would help to have some solid research to pin down this mechanism, but it seems like a promising one. Of course, there are other positive side effects of being around animals too, like playing with a dog or helping out at an animal farm will increase your amount of physical activity, and exercise is a well-known way to boost your endorphin levels. But at the end of the day, when it comes to animal-assisted therapy, it seems to be mostly about the bond.
So these dogs don't just look cute, they can also reduce your stress if you have a strong bond with them. But if you aren't a dog lover, we also got you covered with equine therapy. A horse is like an oversized dog, right? Well, here's me with more on how horses might make for great therapy animals. Psychologists have been using animals in therapy for a long time. Because, well, for many people, few things are better than cuddling up with an adorable dog or cat. But these animals aren't the only option. In fact, there's a whole separate kind of animal-assisted therapy that stars a less common companion. Horses. Although research is ongoing, early evidence has shown that equine therapy seems to help with everything from cerebral palsy to autism. And these treatments aren't just like dog-based therapy, but with bigger animals. Instead, equine therapy seems to be special because horses exist in a class all their own. Equine therapy is also called hippotherapy, which makes sense if you know that hippopotamus translates to river horse. And although most studies on it have involved children, it seems to be a good fit for adults too. Regardless, what this therapy entails can vary quite a bit. Sometimes people are taught about horses and their training, but more often it involves actually caring for animals and learning riding skills. Some language learning therapies even involve both. Like, you might take a spelling quiz while riding a horse as it steps over bars on the ground, saying a letter for each step, and the trainer will stop the horse if you miss. Or you might retell a story by visiting spots in an arena that represent turning points in the plot. Often the therapy is tailored to exactly what it's trying to target. Take autism, for for example. One randomized trial followed 15 kids who spent time in an equine therapy group, and they learned things like grooming and riding. And in the end, they showed improvements in typical social functioning and motor abilities compared to 13 kids in a control group that didn't get therapy. Another similar study tried equine therapy with 19 kids and compared them to a control group of 15 who were on a wait list. In this case, the therapy involved training on how to mount a horse, writing skills, and games like Simon Says. That's the one where someone gives commands, but you're only supposed to do them if they say Simon Says first. And in the study, the kids improved their sensory processing, were less distractible, and picked up on more social cues. But what's a horse doing to help with this? Well, one feature of autism is that you have a hard time focusing your attention on different sensory inputs when stimulation is coming from different directions. But riding a horse is something that can occupy a lot of senses and focuses them on one coherent experience. It combines things like vestibular sense, which is your sense of your head's orientation, and proprioception, your sense of where your body is and where it's moving, along with other touch-based sensations. And that gives someone practice regulating sensory input. Horses also respond to commands, so kids who have trouble with verbal communication can learn with immediate feedback. Horses might provide similar benefits to kids with ADHD too, although the research there is especially limited, so it's hard to say anything for sure. Meanwhile, equine therapy for cerebral palsy looks a bit different. Cerebral palsy develops when some kind of injury happens before the brain fully develops, usually leading to cognitive or motor impairments. A lot of the time, it affects one side of the body more than the other, which means there's a bigger risk of more severe problems as kids' bones grow and they learn to walk. And again, hippotherapy has measurable benefits here. When patients have had horses as part of their therapy, they've been shown to improve their posture and also show more symmetry in their muscle responsiveness. But in this case, it's about the physical experience, not necessarily the sensory one. When you ride a horse, it's a bit of a workout for your ability to balance, so patients need to be making constant adjustments to their posture in response to the horse's motion. Finally, some treatments aren't about the sensory or the physical benefits. They're about the emotional ones. Like for patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, equine therapies have been shown to reduce trauma symptoms and anxiety. Here, it's possible that the level of benefits is about the same as with office-based therapy, but some therapists argue horses are especially helpful. Mostly, horses are hypervigilant to their environment, which might be something a patient with PTSD can relate to. And seeing that giant animal respond to your commands can help people recover a sense of control, too. Equine therapy can even help people boost self-esteem or cope with social stress. But although there are all kinds of horse-based therapies out there, equine therapy doesn't seem ideal for everything. If your concern is your mood or subjective well-being, it looks like dogs or another more typical therapy animal might come out on top. But equine therapy seems to work best if you're treating someone with more medical symptoms. Unfortunately, though, this type of therapy isn't that widely available. Keeping horses is expensive, so depending on where you live, it might be hard to come by. And some researchers have pointed out that this research is pretty limited too. It suffers from things like small sample sizes and sometimes missing control groups, meaning people who got therapy weren't compared to a group that didn't. So while it might be a helpful option when it's available, we'll need more research to really know what's going on. But so far, things seem to be encouraging. From having a small jungle at your home or office to spending time with cute little puppers, there are plenty of ways that nature provides free serotonin. And if you'd like to keep your serotonin tank full, you should check out our video on the surprising benefits of watching cute cat videos. And thanks for joining us today.